Um, I want to thank you, Nicole, for this invitation to speak at the virtual Indian Valley Public Library. It's the first virtual event that I've done, so I'm really excited to be able to share the story with everyone in this way. And it's so exciting to see your faces in the boxes, and I welcome you all. And as Nicole said, if you have questions, as I go along, just put them in the chat box and she'll field the questions when I finish with the formal part of my presentation. But one question first that I'm always asked is, how did I get interested in this topic? And it's been an exciting journey, to be sure. And give me just a minute here and I will share my screen with you so that you're able to see some of the historical photos. Are you seeing it now?
Got it.
Okay. Now I just need to go back to the beginning. Okay. We set to go? I just need to put on pause here. We good now?
Yes.
Okay. So it all started with my grandpa Abe, who was a seagoing cowboy in 1946 to Poland, but I never heard his story. He didn't talk about it. We grandkids didn't know to ask. And several years after Grandpa died, my father gave me this, well, I was aware that there were Polish dolls in Grandpa's attic that we played with as a kid, but I didn't make the connection with his trip until my dad gave me this envelope of photos from Grandpa's trip. And about the time that I got those, I became interested in writing for children. And that topic of seagoing cowboys just kept beckoning to me. So when I took a book writing course through the Institute of Children's Literature, I had to give my instructor several ideas. And I thought, what a great idea, seagoing cowboy trip to Poland. And she thought it was a good idea too, something new and different under the sun. So I started interviewing men that I knew had been seagoing cowboys. And I realized that this history was just hiding away in people's minds and their drawers and their attics. So my mission changed to that of documenting this history. And I've been at it for about 18 years now. And through all that research, I've built up a veritable archive in my office from which I draw the materials for my writings and my presentations like this. So how did this seagoing cowboy program get started? Well, throughout World War II, churches and governments alike had been planning what they could do when the war ended to help suffering countries get on their feet again. And out of this planning came a unique church and government partnership that created the Seagoing Cowboy program. And the two organizations involved were the Brethren Service Committee, which was the outreach arm of the Church of the Brethren, and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. That's always a mouthful, known by its initials, UNRRA, UNRWA, which was kind of a precursor to today's United Nations. Well, the Brethren Service Committee's interest was the Heifer Project, which is today's Heifer International, and some of you may be aware of them. Simply put, the Heifer Project was a plan for sending heifers, which were young cows pregnant for the first time, to help people devastated by war. And it was the brainchild of Church of the Brethren leader Dan West. And it started in 1942, 78 years ago. And by the time the war ended, Heifer Project had a good number of heifers ready to be shipped across the Atlantic. But what they didn't have was the ships they needed or the money to pay for the ships. Well, the other partner in the Seagoing Cowboy program then, UNRWA, was an organization that was created during the war by 44 of the Allied nations to provide relief for the war-devastated Allies. UNRWA wanted to ship some 200,000 head of horses and heifers and mules to Europe to help restore agriculture there. And unlike the Heifer Project, UNRWA had ships available to them through the War Shipping Administration. But what they didn't have were the cattle tenders for their, to take care of the animals on their ships. See, most men at that time were either still in the military or in the defense industry of some kind. So the two organizations made an agreement. UNRWA would ship the Heifer Project animals from the Brethren Service Committee free of charge. And in return, the Brethren Service Committee would serve as the recruiting agency for the cattle tenders that UNRWA would need. And that turned into a much bigger job, I think, than they had ever anticipated it would. Well, from June 1945 through the spring of 1947, when UNRWA disbanded, UNRWA had made 360 livestock trips, transporting some 300,000 animals, of which 4,000 were from the Heifer Project. And they employed around 7,000 seagoing cowboys, ages 16 to 72. So who were these seagoing cowboys? Well, the UNRWA Livestock Program Historical Report says they were farmers and preachers, teachers, students, veterans, conscientious objectors, ne'er-do-wells and doctors, carpenters, plumbers, painters, and importers. They came from a diversity of religious affiliation and racial backgrounds from nearly every state in the Union as well as Canada. Truly as comprehensive a cross-section of American life as could be found, the report says. And 9 of these men came from Telford and Souderton. Oh, what an amazing opportunity these trips were for these men, many of whom had never been out of their county before, let alone out of the country. And how privileged I felt to be in the homes of over 150 of these guys recording their stories, which for the younger cowboys who were in their teens or just out of their teens was often a very formative experience in their lives. Besides Poland, where my grandfather went, the cowboys traveled to countries like Greece and Italy and China, and some docked in Germany for UNRWA shipments that went to Czechoslovakia. Germany, being an enemy during the war, could not receive UNRWA goods because they were just for the Allies. Oh, the cowboys' stories were just so fascinating and compelling and full of drama and danger and adventure and humor and even an occasional romance. And I was hooked. So let's take a look now at your Indian Valley Cowboys. After I titled my presentation, The Cowboys of Telford, Pennsylvania, I realized that the Indian Valley Library also serves Souderton, so I'm including the Souderton boys in here as well. And as I mentioned earlier, there were 9 of the 7,000 UNRWA seagoing cowboys who came from right here in Telford and Souderton. And you might recognize some of these names. The 4 Telford UNRWA cowboys in alphabetical order are Herbert Haberle Jr. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right or not. He was 18 at the time. Lester R. Souder, who was 19. David S. Yoder, who was 25, and Herbert C. Winger, who was 19. The 5 UNRWA cowboys from Souderton are Paul Detweiler Jr., age 21, Frank DeNuncio, age 20, Marvin Garris, age 18, Roy G. Harley, 17, and Henry K. Sportley, 19. But those aren't all, because there were 2 other seagoing cowboy programs that followed UNRWA. The Heifer Project kept going after UNRWA after they made their last shipment in early 1947, and Telford's 5th cowboy, Carlton Force, was one of those Heifer Project cowboys, taking part in one of Heifer's larger programs. They shipped, during the decade of the 1950s, they shipped about 4,000 head of cattle to Germany. And these cattle were given to help some of the 10 to 12 million German people who were sent, people of German heritage living in Eastern European countries, who were sent back to Germany at the end of World War II. And I'll say more about that a little later. Well, Carlton made his trip to Germany in 1955 with a load of 67 heifers. And he always likes to say we arrived with 68 because the calf was born on the way. Birthing happened on most of these trips because the animals were bred before they were sent, and they were all female, mostly all female. Some bulls were sent. But some of them just couldn't wait until they got there to have their calves. This was on a trip to China, this particular picture, and it was a long trip, so there were a lot of calves born. Well, the other livestock shipping program after UNRWA disbanded then was started by 2 Jewish brothers, the Levinson brothers, out of Newport News, Virginia. And they shipped animals to Israel. They recruited mostly Mennonite college students to tend their shipments. And Nicole's husband, Nicole's grandfather, Merrill Detweiler, who was 19 and from Sellersville at the time, was one of those Levinson cowboys. And there are 2 additional cowboys that I'll mention along the way who had Telford connections. They were on the same trip with Lester Souder, and that was Merrill Detweiler's brother Russell, who from Sellersville, and Lester's cousin Eugene Souder, who was from Collegeville at the time. So you can see that this history it's alive right here in Indian Valley. So let's zero in and take a closer look at what these guys would have experienced. All seagoing cowboys had to get seaman's papers, no matter which port they departed from. They had to join the U.S. Merchant Marine through the Coast Guard in order to work on a merchant ship. And this is my grandfather's card because I didn't have any from any of your cowboys. If they were of draft age, the cowboy had to get permission from their draft board to leave the country, like Marvin Garris did here. And for their service in the Merchant Marine, they were paid 1 cent per month. And this was just a formality to make them legal workers on the ship. But don't feel bad for them. They also were paid a sum of $150 from UNRWA. And it was the same, whether their trip took 1 month or 3 or 4, as some trips did. This was Lester Souder's record card, and you can see down there, amount due for trip, $150. Of the Telford Cowboys, Herbert Haberle, Lester Souter, and Herbert Wenger all went to Kavala, Greece, but they were on different trips in 1945 and 1946. And to keep the two Herberts straight, I'll call them Haberle and Wenger. Well, Marvin Garris from Souderton was on the same ship with Herbert Wenger. Marvin on the left in this picture, Herbert on the right. And as I mentioned earlier, Russell Detweiler and Eugene Souter were on Lester's trip, and this is Russell and Lester. Russell on the left, Lester on the right, biding their time in Newport News while the ship was being loaded and getting ready to go. And the black and white photos were taken by Marvin Garris. The colored slides were taken by Eugene Souter. And for Haberle's trip, I'll be using some slides from an Indiana shipmate from his trip. And then I'll be tossing in some images from other cowboys along the way. Well, Lester, Russell, and Eugene were assigned to the SS DePaul Victory. And the loading process was pretty much the same, whether it was in Newport News or elsewhere. Stevedores used what they called a flying stall to pick the animals up and sit them on board. This DePaul Victory ship was one of those ships built en masse during the war, the Victory ships, to carry military equipment, supplies, and troops. And they were refitted to be livestock ships for UNRWA. And on Lester's trip, they had 767 mules as their live cargo. Wenger and Marvin were on a smaller ship, the SS Samuel H. Walker, which was a Liberty ship also mass-produced during the war. I don't have pictures of that ship, but it would look much like this one, the Zona Gale. The Liberty ships, being smaller, held about 300 plus animals. Marvin and Wenger had 150 horses, 150 mules, and 14 cattle on their trip. And that required 12 to 16 seagoing cowboys. The Victory ships held twice as many animals, about 800, more than twice as many. And they needed a crew of 32 cowboys. Once the animals were loaded, a cowboy's work began. Hay and oats had to be pulled up from the bottom of the ship, and the animals had to be fed and watered a couple of times a day, as seen here in Haberle's trip. And the cowboys on the top deck had a little more pleasant job than those down in the holds, like Lester here. You can imagine with the odors down there from all of the animal waste and everything, how stuffy it was, and see how close the heads of the animals were here, which was a problem for a lot of cowboys too. Well, once the ship got on its way, seasickness was a problem. Laid many a cowboy low. I had many of them tell me that at first it felt like they were gonna die, and then they were afraid they wouldn't. Well, here's Herbert Wenger's account. He said, "We sailed from Baltimore at 6 p.m. Saturday, December 14, 1945. By the next morning, we entered the Atlantic Ocean and left the Chesapeake Bay behind. Soon after that is when many of the cattlemen became seasick, including me. It wasn't until several days later that most of the men had gotten acclimated to the rolling and pitching of the ship. From then on, seasickness was never a problem, no matter how rough the sea became." That was a good thing, he says, because the North Atlantic in the winter has many storms. We experienced storms so severe that waves broke over the bow and the rear of the ship came completely out of the water. During the night in one of those storms, I was thrown up in the air and hit the springs of the bunk above me. The ship rolled so far that the water came over the sides of the ship. Waves also crashed over the on-deck stalls of the horses and mules. And as a result of the cold, wet conditions, we lost about 9 horses to pneumonia. Dead animals were thrown overboard. Mules seemed to be made of sturdier stuff since we did not lose any mules. And he goes on with his account. I was assigned to take care for mules and horses. I found that horses were easier to take care of than mules. When a horse becomes frightened, he kicks straight back. However, a mule will look where you are and then kick directly at you. We also found out that horses, as well as mules, will bite. And some of the cowboys I interviewed still had scars on their chests or their shoulders. And there was one cowboy who told me that he was wearing Oshkosh Bagosh overalls with the straps. A horse grabbed him by the straps on his back and threw him down the aisle. So there was humor as well as danger on these trips. But the job wasn't all work. When things were caught up, there was time for just hanging out or reading or doing laundry, however you could figure to do that. Some of the guys attached it to ropes and threw their pants out in the water or their shirts to get washed that way. And a lot of them lost their clothes that way. There was invariably somebody on board who could cut hair. And on Sundays, many of the crews had worship services wherever they could find a place on ship to do it. And the day came for these Indian Valley cowboys, after passing the Rock of Gibraltar and entering the Mediterranean Sea, when their ship finally reached Kavala, Greece. It's located way up the Aegean Sea on the northeastern coast of Greece. And there in the harbor, they saw some of the remnants of the war, greeted the cowboys. After docking then, unloading began, and recipients came to take their animals home. Marvin Garris says on the bottom of this photo, the only foal born that lived was in my care. And with their work finished, the cowboys were issued shore leave so that they could explore this ancient city with its old city wall. I love this picture. They're just so carefree. And the many other ancient structures there. Nearby sites they visited included the ruins of the biblical city of Philippi. And I'm guessing they wouldn't be allowed to climb on that like they were doing today. And some went to the creek where Paul met Lydia in the Bible and saw the cell where Paul was jailed. Well, Wenger was impressed by the extreme poverty in Kavala. He said the people were dressed in rags and very poor. I remember one little boy who came on the ship and went through the garbage can looking for food to take home. After leaving Kavala then, Wenger's ship went on down to Crete to unload more of the cargo. And he said one highlight on Crete was visiting the ruins of the ancient city of Knossos. The city records go back to about 2500 BC, he said. The city and palace of the king was being excavated and restored. I sat on King Minos' throne, a carved stone seat, he says. We also saw the oldest known bathtub carved out of solid stone. Cowboys who docked near Athens, Greece then got to visit the Acropolis and the other ancient ruins there. So you can see that these guys had a lot of sightseeing opportunities. On the trips home then, there was plenty of time for whatever kinds of entertainment or activity or non-activity the Cowboys could dream up, as well as fire and lifeboat drills, which they had going both directions, and maybe an order by the captain to clean out the stalls like Haberley's trip had to do. On Lester's trip home, cake was on the menu for Christmas dinner. These guys were usually fed very well. Well, your Indian Valley Cowboys who went to Poland had quite a different experience from those who went to Greece. These included David S. Yoder, Paul Detweiler Jr., Frank D'Annunzio, Roy Harley, and Henry Swartley. I don't have any direct information from any of these men on their trips, but I do have photos from many other cowboys who went to Poland, which will give you an idea of what they saw and what they experienced. Their route usually took them up the English Channel and across Germany on the Kiel Canal, with its many fascinating bridges, like this one that had a ferry that went across under a railroad bridge. And my husband and I were able in 2013 to take a cruise on the canal and see all these bridges. And it was the 100th anniversary of this particular bridge. They were having a huge celebration that day, so that was fun. Then from the Kiel Canal, they went across the Baltic Sea to Poland, where they docked in Novi Port, which was the port area for the city of Gdansk. And the livestock were unloaded here, just in the same manner that they had been loaded onto the ship. Also, the manure was offloaded because this was a precious fertilizer for these people. After 5-6 years of war, their fields were depleted. Many of them had been torn up for battlefields. So you can see that the devastation here was much worse than what the Cowboys in Kavala saw. And the sightseeing opportunities were quite different than in Greece. The city of Gdansk, Danzig was the German name, it was Gdansk, the Polish name after the war, was 90% destroyed. And UNRWA took many of the cowboy crews on a tour of the area, piled them in the back of a truck, and off they went. And besides the ruins of Gdansk, then, they were taken out into the country to see the collection sites for some of the animals, where the lucky farmers who got them would come and pick them up. Some were taken to the nearby Stutthof concentration camp, and the tours usually ended at this restaurant in nearby Zopat, which was a resort city which hadn't been, oh dear, happened. Are you still on?
Yes.
You're still seeing the screen?
Yes.
Okay, there it is. Sorry about that. Must have hit my computer. Zopat had been a resort city, so it wasn't heavily damaged during the war. And the cowboys were served a thank you banquet by the Polish Department of Agriculture and UNRWA, and a lot of them felt uncomfortable eating such a special meal when the people that they had been associating with on dock and invited into some of their homes were all going hungry. So that was a little difficult for some of them. Some of the Mennonite cowboys then on their own sought out the Danzig Mennonite church, which had been destroyed in the war, and they picked up artifacts which they've taken home and are in a lot of Mennonite museums around the country. Many of the crews were taken by this enterprising young man to see nearby battlefields. His name was Martin, and he was in one of my grandfather's photos. He was in a lot of cowboy photos. He was really an enterprise. He spoke English as well as, I think his family was German, a German-Polish mixture. And he took them to explore these battlefields at their own risk. And it's amazing that none of these cowboys were injured because there was still live ammunition laying around. Well, besides going to Poland then, David S. Yoder made another trip, this one first actually, in March 1946 on the SS Henry Dearborn, taking a load of heifers for Czechoslovakia that docked in Bremen, Germany. The heifers were sent by rail inland then to Czechoslovakia because Germany wasn't able to receive their goods, as I said. And you can see that Bremen's destruction rivaled that of Gdansk. Well, Bremen was in the US zone of occupation during the war, and the US Army had posts there. So seeing this destruction, you'd think there wasn't much for the cowboys to do. But David Yoder's supervisor sent a report from Bremen to the Seagoing Cowboy office in New Windsor that I have a copy of. And he says, since arriving here last Saturday, we have enjoyed the Bremen Symphony Orchestra. There's more of the destruction. We saw Claudia, a play for service people, movies in English with German subtitles at a house where uniformed men were not allowed, and American talkies at the Red Cross. This is the building where the Red Cross had their club. Some of our boys, he said, have bicycled around the outlying country. The Army Educational Department has taken us on a tour of a good-sized dairy operated by the senator in charge of labor and farming. We have been supplied with ping pong, volleyball, chess, checker, domino, cribbage, and reading materials for the long journey home. And some of us have established relations not only with Czechoslovakian men who came to take our load of cattle last Monday on a 60-car train, but we have acted as white corpuscles in a territory that is terribly torn by war. And that was a theme that I heard from most of the cowboys, the horrible destruction of war that they witnessed. They were some of the first civilians to get into Europe after World War II. And they came home telling their stories, and they fueled the energy for a lot of relief efforts from the need that they were describing. Well, fast forward 5 years, and the Mennonite cowboys were making the Levinson Livestock Company's trips to the new country of Israel, delivering horses and heifers and mules. Merrill Detweiler of Sellersville made his trip on the SS Columbia Heights in December of 1951. That's the same ship, but this was a different crew of cowboys, I think. And like most of those cowboys, Merrill got to visit Jerusalem. This is the Via Dolorosa, and Nazareth. And some of them were able to visit Bethlehem, and they were see the Bedouin tent camps. Just fascinating experience for them. Fast forward another 5 years, and Carlton Force of Telford made his trip to Germany in November of 1955. And you can see on his heifer project record card that there's no mention of pay like there had been on the UNRWA cards, because the heifer seagoing cowboys were strictly volunteers. They would not likely have seen the same devastation in Bremen that the cowboys a decade earlier had seen. But many of these heifer cowboys got to have an experience which the UNRWA cowboys didn't. They were taken to see the distribution ceremonies of the heifers, where drawings were held to see which heifer would go to which farmer. And some of them were taken to visit recipients from earlier shipments and witness the immense joy over their good fortune. You can just see the joy in these people's faces for having a heifer after having lost everything in the war. And this leads me to the legacy of the seagoing cowboys. What these people did, what the cowboys did for the people who ultimately received the animals that they cared for on the seas. It's a rich legacy, to be sure, a legacy of lifting people from the depths of despair and giving them hope. And this came vividly clear to me when I traveled to Europe in 2013. I had the phenomenal experience to meet recipients of both Heifer Project and UNRWA animals and was able to hear their stories. In Poland, I met 89-year-old Stanislav Debert, and I had a delightful visit with him and his wife and one of his daughters. And Stanislav told me his story. He said when he left his town of Kielce, he was just clinging to the roof of a train with nothing more than the clothes on his back to get to a safer part of Poland. That fall, he and his wife and child were relocated to an abandoned farm near Gdansk. And it was probably one of those farms that was vacated by Germans who were sent back to Germany at the end of the war. And a lot of Mennonites had settled in that delta area around Gdansk, so it very well could have been an abandoned Mennonite farm. He said when they arrived there, there was nothing to eat. No fruits, no vegetables, just nothing. And about that time, the SS Santiago Iglesias had arrived in Novi Port with a load of 150 Heifer Project animals, as well as another 225 heifers from UNRWA. And Stanislav received one of those Heifer Project heifers. And he told me it was their heifer and the horse and staple food goods that they received from UNRWA that kept them alive that winter. It was a severe winter, weather-wise in Poland. And he said it was, the heifer was so important to them that they kept her in the house with them to keep the Russians who were occupying the country at the time from stealing her. And it brought tears to his eyes when he told me that 5 years later, it was such a sad day for his family when their heifer got sick and died. So you can see that the seagoing cowboys delivered hope to Stanislav and his family and to the thousands of others like them. On that trip in 2013, I also had the amazing opportunity to meet with 11 families who had settled in the Reichswald community in Germany. Each of these families had received a heifer that was delivered in 1950. These people were among those millions of Germans who had been sent back to Germany at the end of the war. And some of their families had lived in the Eastern European countries for centuries. Well, this was part of the Potsdam Agreement. And they had to find, the new West German government had to find places to settle these 10 to 12 million displaced persons. And one of those settlements then was this Reichswald community, which was built out of a damaged forest, the Reichswald forest, damaged during the war. And to that community then, Heifer Project shipped 42 heifers, which were delivered in June of 1950 to help these people get on their feet again. You can see from this map the many different areas that these people came from. And I asked them, I said, had it been hard to form a community coming from so many different places? And they said, no. Our need welded us together. We all had nothing. They did, most of them have the German language in common though. And one statement made by Mariana Quelling Arts summarizes the importance of this heifer project shipment for these people and for the nearly 4,000 other families who received heifer project animals throughout that decade. Mariana said when they received their heifer, they wondered who would give us such a large gift. Up to that point, she said, everything had been taken away from us. Who would give us a cow? She said, our heifer lifted us from the depths of despair and gave us hope. And that, my friends, is the legacy of the Seagoing Cowboys, lifting people from the depths of despair and giving them hope. I've authored a children's picture book called The Seagoing Cowboy that highlights this legacy. And it's published by Brethren Press. And I'll just put in a plug here. If you need a Christmas gift or a birthday gift for a child from the ages of about 4 to 10, or for an elementary school elementary school teacher, this would be an excellent choice. It tells the story of the trip of a fictional cowboy and his friend delivering horses and heifers to Poland. And it's based on actual events. Everything in the book happened to one cowboy or another. So it's a true story. And it's illustrated by the wonderful Clara Ewart out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. The book designer then came up with this fantastic map at the end of the book, which shows the route that they took and photos from the real Cowboys albums. And then there's an author's note that gives history behind the story in the back. The book can be ordered online through brethrenpress.com or by calling their 800 number, which I have on the screen here. And you won't find it on Amazon because Amazon shafts small publishers. Brethren Press had lost money when they tried to sell through Amazon, so they don't do that anymore. I also invite you to check out my Seagoing Cowboys website at seagoingcowboys.com. And I post a blog there twice a month, every second and fourth Friday, which would be a great source of information if you want to know more about this fascinating history. I don't think we have any cowboys present with us tonight, but if they do, I would invite them to, if they want to add a highlight from their trip, I would invite them to unmute themselves and make themselves known. If not, I turn it back to you, Nicole, to field some questions.
All right, great. So we did have a few in the chat box, and you can keep them coming. So Jean wanted to know, and you kind of touched upon this, did any of the Cowboys make more than one trip?
Absolutely, yes. A lot of them did, and as far as I can figure from the records, Luke Baumberger, who was from Mount Joy, Pennsylvania, made the most, 9 trips, because this is an interesting story. When he was on his first trip, he turned 17, and the draft board came to his family saying, where is he? Or he turned 18, whatever draft age became back then. And they wondered where he was and what he was doing. And when they told him that he was on this trip, this was August of 1945, they said, well, just tell him to keep doing that for his service. So until he was discharged, he had made 9 trips. So, yeah.
Wow. So we have a couple other comments about knowing of Heifer, but they didn't hear about the story, and can't even imagining the suffering, and then the gratitude that the people would have. Another person wanted to know, actually the same person wants to know, has there ever been a reunion of the Seagoing Cowboys?
Yes, yes. Heifer International took over the Cowboy program once UNRWA was disbanded, and on their 50th anniversary, they held a gathering of cowboys, and on their 60th anniversary, they had another one, and on their, let's see, 70th anniversary, we had some special events in several places, and then some of the crews had reunions. There were a couple of crews who met about every 5 years until just recently. There aren't that many cowboys still living today, so yeah, the reunions are kind of stopping, but yeah.
So the next question comes from me. So what is your next step for your research? I know you did the children's book, but do you have any other plans to do?
I do. I have another children's picture book manuscript nearly ready to send out, but it's terribly hard to find a publisher these days, so there's no promises on that. I would still like to get back to the novel that I drafted. It did get drafted and revised a few times, but the market kind of fell out of straight historical fiction for young adults when I was ready to submit it. And if it didn't have a fantasy element or a romance, you couldn't sell it. So that's been resting. My big project right now, I'm working on a history of Heifer International, the first decade of the Heifer Project. And that's, I have so much material to wade through. Finally got started writing in January. I'm up to 1946 now, and I need to get to 1953. So you can see it's going to be another year and a half, 2 years probably till I get my draft done on that. And eventually a book for adults about the Seagoing Cowboys too.
Do you have anyone who normally helps you with your research?
No.
Okay, that's all you. Okay.
Yeah.
So with all of the trips that you've taken, it's all self-funded?
Pretty much self-funded, yep.
Wow, okay. It's dedication. All right, do we have any other questions? Okay, and you can unmute yourself if you feel more comfortable than putting it in the chat box. And while you think about it, I'll just say I want to thank you, Peggy. This was enlightening. I'm going to bother Grandpa more with more questions about his trip. I look forward to your upcoming ventures, and I really want to thank you and for everyone else who joined us tonight. It was very interesting. It's something that was so closely connected to our community, but I've never really heard of it, and I'm glad that you're doing this research.
Yes.
I have another question. Were horses, cows, and mules the only animals shipped?
No. There were a few goats through the UNRWA program. There were a few goats shipped, few rabbits. There were some chickens shipped, a few sheep. Yeah, and then when it just became heifer, then they started expanding their types of animals too, according to what the countries needed. Yeah.
Fish. All right. Well, I want to thank you tonight. And just a reminder to everyone, I will be sending out a link with this recording so then you can share it with people for a limited amount of time. We're only going to keep it up for a little bit amount of time, but I'll let everyone go. And thank you so much, Peggy, and for this audience, because if you didn't sign up, I would have enjoyed it just listening to Peggy talk, but it's really great to have you all here. And don't forget to check our website, which is ivpl.org, for all the upcoming programs that we have and any changes that we're doing to our services. So thank you so much and have a great day, everyone.
And thank you so much for your tolerance of my glitches.
Yes.
Oh, it was good.
We have a very patient community. I know they work with, they're so supportive. That's part of the reason why I love working with at Indian Valley. It's a really great community.
Thank you, Nicole.
Good to see you, Peggy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, well,
I had one brief comment. I had a talk with one of the Seagoing Cowboys, and he was supposed to be in Poland for a certain period of time. And then when he had to get back to the United States, there was ice, too much ice in every place. And I think it was 6 months till he got back. And he was expected to be back for work, or I'm not sure whether it was on his father's farm or not. But there were a lot of unknown things that it didn't work like clockwork.
Yeah. That was in the winter of 1947, January, February 47. That was an extremely harsh winter. And there were 7 ships that got stuck in the ice off the coast of Sweden.
wow.
And that's actually where one of the romances happened too, because the Cowboys would walk ashore. They were stuck in the ice for 7 weeks. And the Cowboys would walk ashore into Sweden, and one guy met his wife there. Yeah, lots of fascinating stories.
Well, I look forward to reading more about it, both the fiction and nonfiction. I think I've grown to appreciate historical fiction, so I hope someone picks it up.
Yeah.
All right, so
Were there any females on the trips? The one picture there that you said was a religious service on a ship, at least one of the people had real long hair, which I thought was not a real common style then. So I wondered if there were ever women in any of the programs.
No, not to be through the UNRWA years, they had to join the Merchant Marine, and the Merchant Marine did not allow women. There may have been an occasional woman who was a wife of somebody who needed to get to Europe, but that was very rare. But once it became under heifer and they didn't have the UNRWA restrictions, then women were able to to go. And there were cowgirls along the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Okay, well, I am going to end the recording now.